What's going on, everyone? Welcome to a Wednesday edition of Back Your Play with Q. As always, I'm your host, Rich Quinones. Get social with us on social media, Twitter, IG at Rich Q. Check out the channel, Rich Q. A lot of good content, a lot of good interviews and segments as well. We'll keep it rolling with the NFL later on this evening with a couple shows, but we got to talk a little baseball. It's always great to talk to our good friend, Steve Gardner at Steve A. Gardner, USA Today, senior fantasy editor, baseball writer, reporter, and a voter in the MLB Hall of Fame. And of course, that process. Steve, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing great. How are you, Rich?
I'm doing well. It's good to catch up with you. So, all right, I feel as though we've had these conversations over the last 15 plus years. It's almost like March Madness Selection Sunday. There's some poor 20 and 25 mid-major that doesn't get into the dance and everyone goes berserk and nuts. So I was happy that finally my guy McGriff got in. Now we learn that Scott Rolen gets in. I put up the numbers. You know, I'm a numbers guy, and I think you kind of get a sense. We'll probably have a little fun and go back and forth. Was Rolen, in your estimation, a guy that can just roller skate into Cooperstown, or did you have to take a closer look at the numbers?
No, I did have to take a closer look. And when I was, before I had a ballot, it's easy. It's really easy, in fact, to make all sorts of snap judgments and say, oh, well, he wasn't a Hall of Famer in my eyes, or this guy was, and this guy wasn't. But, when you actually have to sign your name to something, you do take a closer look. And I have to admit that I was not a huge Scott Rolen fan. Certainly the folks in some cities in the major leagues were not fans of Scott Rolen's, but nevertheless, you take a look at his consistency, you look at how good he was defensively, in addition to the great offensive numbers that he put up. You look at the advanced metrics and wins above replacement, and you add all those things up over his lengthy career. That's a heck of a player. And, in diving in, he didn't, some of the defensive plays maybe wow you, but he wasn't that flashy, didn't call attention to himself. But when you look at all the numbers added up over time, it's like, this guy's sure, he's a definite Hall of Famer. So every year that I voted, I've checked the box for Scott Rolen, and I'm finally happy to see him get in.
17 seasons, 1997 Rookie of the Year, top 25 MVP voting just 3 times in his career. I mean, 2004, I think, was his best standing. I think he finished 4th. Obviously, Bonds had that monster season. You look at his numbers, over 2,000 hits. I believe 70-something of them came his last season. So 2077, 316 home runs, 281. You can't dismiss the leather. We know that. He played the position brilliantly. I look at his slugging, I look at the OPS. I don't see flashy numbers except for, the gold gloves, the defense. But this is not about my issue with Scott Rolen, right? Because I think a lot of times we look at these guys and people try to make it personal. That's not it. I would say this: if Scott Rolen, by those numbers and by what we believe when we start to break down the sport, your era, the analytics, then explain to me how Greg Nettles is not in the Hall of Fame. Because Greg Nettles, to me, I think he has a couple points higher when it comes to WAR. He led the AL in assists 4 times, AL CS MVP in 81. He single-handedly saved the 78 World Series when the Yanks were down 2 games to 1, close to 400 home runs, 2,225 hits, 2-time Gold Glove. And oh, by the way, he had to deal with one of your guys, the human vacuum cleaner out there in Baltimore for 15 straight years, and Brooks Robinson. And I think one year Aurelio Rodriguez won it for the Tigers, in an era where you also had the Mike Schmitz in the NL, 6-time All-Star, over 300 doubles, I believe. I mean, the numbers to me, an MVP, right? I pulled them up, finished 5th and 6th, 77, 78 respectively. Obviously, Jim Rice was the best player in baseball. We can agree in 1978. But how does a player like Greg Nettles, and you think about those 78, those Yankee teams with Guidry and Catfish and Reggie, and how is he not in the Hall of Fame? And we're going to put Scott Rolen in.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what. number one, completely different Baseball Writers Association electorate back then. And, we don't know, or we didn't know, I say we, baseball writers didn't know an awful lot back then about how good players were beyond just their hits, RBIs, and batting average, that sort of thing. We can appreciate what kind of a player Greg Nettles was. We can appreciate what kind of a player Lou Whitaker was, Dwight Evans, Bobby Grich. I mean, a lot of those guys, when you put them up to the sabermetric microscopes, you're looking at guys that would be, I don't know, slam dunks is the right word, but very, very easily getting in, I would think, because of the way that they played the game and what we appreciate now in the total package. So I think you could go back and make a case for a lot of guys, and the case that you just made for Nettles is a great one. And I think maybe we didn't appreciate because you had Reggie Jackson and all of those guys taking the headlines away from the nuts and bolts guys that kind of held the Yankees teams together.
So when you think of when you go down the list, Matthews and Brooks and Schmidt and Boggs and Chipper Jones and Brett, it's hard for me to stick Rolen, and it's hard for me to do that. And I watched his career, and I remember covering some of those Philly teams way early on when he came up. And you mentioned, not being liked in certain cities. That was certainly the case in Philadelphia. He wanted out. He couldn't stand the media. He couldn't stand the fan base. The knock on him was he was not a pressure player. And what happens, right? You go to St. Louis, Midwest, a little more laid back here and there. And
a great postseason player in St. Louis. He won a couple of World Series there.
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, I think when people start to say, well, one guy's, I always equate it to, let me take a look at the numbers. Like my thing was, if you stick Rolen in, Scott Rolen in, then you have to put a guy like Greg Nettles in. I mean, I can even make a case for Ron Santo. I mean, Ron Santo to me is or I'm sorry, Steve Garvey, different position, but Steve Garvey, I apologize. Steve Garvey, Santo took what? How many years Santo finally gets in?
He took the whole time, didn't he?
Yeah.
And got in from the Veterans Committee.
Yeah. So I look at, a guy like Garvey, we can go back to the Kent conversation in a minute. How about David Wright? Do you believe David Wright, top MVP, finished 3 times, 390 doubles, 296 batting average, over 1,700 hits, 8-time All-Star, 240 something odd home runs, close to 200 stolen bases. He was a rock star in New York, but he had the bad back. Is that going to hurt David Wright?
I'll tell you what, and he's up next year, right? Is going to be when he comes on the ballot for the first time. So we'll get a chance to hash out all that in detail. I'll tell you one thing though that kind of encompasses this entire conversation is that the number of third basemen that are enshrined in Cooperstown is really small when you consider the percentages of players at other positions. It's hard to get in. And I think, you say, or critics would say, Scott Rolen, he doesn't stack up to, Brooks Robinson and all of these other guys, throughout the history, and Mike Schmidt and all that. I mean, who does from that span of time? I mean, there aren't that many great third basemen when you go from Chipper Jones to Nolan Arenado, who's building a case, maybe not there yet, but you look at Arenado's career and you look at Scott Rolen's career, those guys are pretty close in parallel. So that's kind of how I look at it, is that their third base is an underrepresented position, and Scott Rolen was certainly Hall of Fame worthy at that position among his peers, and that's kind of what pushed him over the edge for me.
Listen, it's a fair point, and it's a valid point, because if you look at other positions where it's, I don't like to say watered down or saturated, I guess you have to. In the NFL, we have the argument with wide receivers.
Clustered. How about that? Clustered. Talent clusters. There are clusters of talent.
Yeah, right. Let me just write that down. 100%. That is, that's why they call it the hot corner. No one's disputing his talent and his defense. But again, I have more of a problem with, I feel as though baseball and I say this with respect to the voters, the Hall of Fame voters, is starting to become like the NFL, where we want to push a certain narrative or agenda when it has to do with a certain play. Like Terrell Owens. Terrell Owens was not a likable guy, right? We know that, but there's no reason he should have waited as long as he had.
Yep.
A guy like Jim Rice, even Carlton. Carlton never got along with the media. Jim Rice and the Boston, this, they hated each other, right? I mean,
Right.
he made it, no, but yet
Dick Allen still hasn't gotten in.
And he's worthy of the Hall of Fame, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's worthy. The Albert Bell conversation we have. I had this discussion with my buddies this morning. I was like, look at a 5 to 6 year stretch. This guy was arguably the best player in baseball. I put up Steve Garvey's numbers as well, because I think I believe, listen, someone under 30 has no idea who the hell Scott Rolen is. They don't. That's another problem we have, but that's a conversation for another day. I look at Garvey and I say Garvey's credentials, where he stacks up, where he played the position at the time, and I know he moved around, then eventually first. Okay, fine. You can make a case, Garvey. I can go back, MVP 74, NLCS, close to 300 home runs, almost 2,700 hits. The slugging percentage, the WAR, the on base, it's there. Kent, I can make the same argument for Kent. Why is a player like Jeff Kent so dismissed when it comes to the voting?
I think there may be some personality conflicts in there too that still linger. I think for me, I like the well-rounded players, and I like guys that are good defensively, offensively, that run the bases well. Jeff Kent obviously can hit like nobody's business, and was, maybe the greatest, certainly in our lifetime, the greatest hitting second baseman that we've ever seen.
I agree to that.
But then what was the era that he played in also, offensive numbers were up across the board. So you kind of have to take those career totals and say, would Joe Morgan have hit more home runs than Jeff Kent in the same era? That sort of things. You can make those debates. But that's where, you look at the OPS plus, things like that kind of incorporate that into things. You look at, wins above replacement incorporates base running and defensive metrics and things like that in there. So, to me, Jeff Kent was certainly right at that borderline, and it would not have bothered me at all if he made a final year push and got in. I would tip my cap to him. But I didn't vote for him when the ballot. I think it was another thing with Jeff Kent too. If I can throw this in.
Yeah, please.
He was on there when the ballot was really crowded with Bonds and Clemens, and all those guys were
Numbers
taking up
game. I get it. You take away votes. I get that.
And I had trouble, figuring out which 10 I was going to vote for, the first 2 times I was, filling out my ballot.
He's got the most home runs for a second baseman
Ever.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think he's got 376, 377. You mentioned the WAR, the wins above replacement. How much stock do you put into that? Because I feel over the last 15 to 20 years, now everyone, that's the sexy term to use. When before it was just watch the film, the eye test, right?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that's what we had. We had your slash line totals. Your runs and RBIs and batting average and all that. I do, because I think that it does give a nice way to compare players across eras, and because it adjusts for the offensive environment at the time, it adds in a defensive component. And I have to say too, little caveat, measuring defense is not a precise thing like figuring out a guy's OPS. I mean, there is a lot of subjectivity in that, and for those reasons, most of the time it kind of jives with what I see and what I've seen with my eyes. It ranks Andrew Jones as one of the best defensive players of all time, and to me, that checks out.
We had that conversation.
Detracts. Yep, it detracts from some people, and Jeff Kent being one of them, who I feel like, there are plays that he should have made He did not have the range that other second basemen did, that sort of thing. So I do give those WAR credence. But yeah, there are two different versions of WAR too. So you can manipulate that if you want to whichever fits your argument, fits your narrative. So a lot of times I think sports writers have their points of view and they cherry pick the stats that make that look more legitimate, more more of a certainty.
Sure.
And I do that. Everybody does that.
But
But for the most part, I feel like that WAR does a pretty good job of it. So when I'm looking at all of the the pluses and minuses, I'll give that significant weight.
so I want to go back to Santo for a minute. And it's funny because somebody was tweeting at me earlier today, and and again, my mind slipped for a minute. And I was like, wait a second, he eventually got in. So I was about to bark at you, but it's all in good fun and love. When you have a player that's on the ballot, and then obviously you have to go, and when we talk about the contemporary ballot and the voting, and then eventually he gets in 10, 15, 20 something odd years later, the last chance, so to speak. If we look at a guy like, McGriff, what do you think's the tipping point? Is it sentiment, or is it more of the old school voters, or is it pushback, pushback, pushback? And the reason I bring it up is because, again, I go back to guys like Garvey. I go back to guys like Albert Bell. I go back to Greg Nettles. His numbers stack up. It's not his fault that Brooks Robinson won 15 straight Gold Gloves. It's
Right.
not. And he just happened to play in the AL, and those were rivals, right? Bitter rivals. And then you had the influx of the George Bretts of the world. So a guy like Santo, is it just, yeah, you know what? Let's just put the guy in. Or do they really, and I know you can't speak to the whole, everyone that votes, but the process itself, it seems as though once there's enough push, then they break.
Well, I think narrative is huge when it comes to the Hall of Fame era committees. When they get 16 people in a room and they start talking about these candidates, like, Fred McGriff was on that ballot this year with Barry Bonds,
Yep.
Roger Clemens, Kurt Schilling, Albert Bell, I think, was on that as well. And, when you get people in a room and you start talking about things, that's when the narrative and the forcefulness of some person's opinion, that's when that plays into it. And I think that's one of the things that I don't like about the way that the NFL Hall of Fame does, is because they have that exact same situation. And so personalities come into it in a major way. Whereas in the baseball writers, you fill out your ballot, you send it in, you make your decision, and you can talk to everybody and interact with people on social media or anything, but none of your peers is telling you how you should vote. And I think that's the way that it should be, and that's the best way to do it.
Should there be more transparency of what writers or who they're voting for? Because there are some, and I'm not going to name them, that happen to cover a team like, I don't know, the Astros for years, that believes every Astro player should be in the Hall of Fame. And, it doesn't work like that, right? You could have covered Baltimore for 20 years, the O's are your team, but you can't sit there and say Brady Anderson is a Hall of Famer. The problem is when you, and I say it, but it bothers me because, again, I had a conversation with a friend of mine, and I said, look, just because Larry Sheets hit 30 home runs one year, does that mean that someone at the time in Montreal is going to stick his name? Well, I think when you start to do that, and then you get people that are starting to vote for some of these, oh man, yeah, it takes away from the guys that are deserving.
I think there's a lot less of that now, because the Baseball Writers Association as a whole wants to have their votes, everybody's vote, made public. And the BBWA submitted this, took a vote. It was overwhelmingly like 80% of the BBWAA wanted to make all votes public. We sent that to the Hall, and the Hall of Fame said, no, we will make it non-mandatory. And so there is a box on the ballot that says, you may, can the Hall make your ballot public? And you have to check that. to be able to have, it released in the entire list of, comprehensive list of who voted for whom. So
Why do you
it
think
used
that
to
is?
be, Hmm?
Why do you think that is?
I think the hall wants to protect the older school voters that may cast some of those strange ballots.
That's a
Because if
problem.
you make it public, you've got to answer for it, and people know where you work, they know who you are, and then you can't throw that stuff out there
That's a
for no
problem.
reason.
But you just said it. That's a problem. Because at least when you come on and I drill you for the past 15 something years, you back it up and you make a compelling argument. These other voters, the older school guys, want to take the ball, so to speak, and go home. That's a problem. I believe
Mhm.
you need transparency. No one's going to sit here and say they're going to drive to somebody's house and
Right.
blindfold them and take them to a ballpark and make them change their ballot
Right.
but I think if there's transparency, at least you can go on the record and say, look, I'm stating my case, because I believe when you start to get Joe, Tom, Dick, and Harry, who are voters for the past 20, 30 years, and they just start checking just for the hell of checking, and they're not held accountable. Again, you're taking votes away from players that may be on the fringe, and a vote here and there, a percentage here and there can tip them and get them in.
Or submitting a blank ballot too.
Which is worse.
That's another thing. Yeah, that's even worse.
Then pull the cord. They should not be allowed to vote.
And those guys are dropping off the rolls, by the way. If you're not an active member, I think you get a grace period. If you're not an active, covering a team or baseball in general for a certain number of years, like 5 years after you go inactive, then you're in position to be dropped out of the Hall of Fame voters. And so the Hall has taken that seriously. So we're getting there, I think.
So I belong to the Boxers Writers of America Association. So I have a vote when it comes to regionalized Hall of Fame voting for boxing and whatnot. If I don't believe who's on the ballot, I will let them know. Like, I take that serious. I don't want to vote someone or check it or submit just because, right? And then eventually down the road, when you get the opportunity for, say, Conestoga and whatnot, those are the big time when there's a lot more credence and credibility to your name to voting per se. It's and that takes time, right? You still have to build equity in covering the sport, and I'm okay with that. I just believe some of these older school ones, like I feel maybe now with the new school, like everyone knows about the steroid era. Like we can accept that. You've said so many times, stick a ring, given the asterisk. I go back to the adage, can you tell the story of baseball without X, Y, and Z? And if you can't tell the story or the history of the game without said players, there's something wrong with that. And I understand it's never going to be perfect. I know it's flawed, but I would love to be a fly on the room when some of these names come, the Albert Bells come up, right? The Says or the Garveys or the whomever. I would love to be a fly on the wall and hear some of these discussions on why or why not. Like, how do you tell me Albert Bell for 4 to 5 year period was not the best player in baseball and doesn't deserve to be in the Hall of Fame? Why? Because the guy was a jerk? It's not the Hall of Morality or the Hall of Character.
We certainly have seen that for sure. And I'll tell you one more thing too, as we're talking about ballots being revealed. We still don't know who didn't vote for Derek Jeter. There was one person who did not vote for Derek Jeter in his first year of being eligible. Certainly the public would like to know, not necessarily who it was,
right,
but why. Was there some vendetta? Was there, he wasn't Babe Ruth, or I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, the accountability, transparency, I think is imperative. And the closer we can get to that, the better for me.
You had 28 players, 14 first-year candidates, others that received votes, and excuse me for looking down at my notes, more than 50% of the ballots. Todd Helton, 72.2, Billy Wagner, 68%, Jones, 58, Gary Sheffield, 55, Helton, 52, Billy Wagner, 51. In his 10th and final season on the ballot, Jeff Kent received 181 votes, 46% Carlos Beltran. Top vote getter among first-year candidates receiving 46. You would venture to guess that'll move up for him. So those that I named, aside from Kent, and you already believe Jones is a Hall of Famer, what about Helton, Wagner, Sheffield? Those
Checked
guys.
them all. Checked them all.
You did.
I did. I think, I saw a stat earlier about how the number of players whose careers began in each decade,
Yeah.
and the percentage of players in the Hall of Fame from those years, like the 1920s, like over a third of all the players that played there and got, playing time and everything, are in the Hall of Fame. Right now, we're down to like 8%. It's getting more and more and more exclusive. And I remember, thinking about the Hall of Fame before I even had a vote of how it should be the best of the best. We've been super selective as a group to the point where, a lot of those guys, and, as our whole conversation has talked about today, there are a lot of guys that are being left out that probably deserve to be in the Hall of Fame, but you can't get 75% of people to agree on anything. And because it's such a larger number now than it was when people were voting back in the 50s, it makes it that much more difficult.
Again, a couple minutes with Steve Gardner, USA Today. Rich Quinones here, Wednesday edition of BYP. You mentioned it gets a little more selective, and we always talk about the analytics, the stats. You brought up WAR. We know it by now, right? How much stock do you put in when you're breaking down the numbers as a voter to say, like a guy like Helton, who played in a very hitter-friendly ballpark, right? When you look at durability, consistency, injury-free, playing in one spot at, a long time, do you take in consideration if it's a hitter-friendly park, it's a pitcher's park? Just kind of walk us like Steve Gardner's mindset.
Well, yeah, and I thought, we're talking about OPS plus, which basically kind of negates that advantage and just said, how much better were you than everybody else that was playing in every other park that you were playing in? And it indexes that. Todd Helton still comes out really, really well. And I think one of the things, one of those factors that you can't really measure is that he does reap the benefits of playing at Coors Field and playing at altitude, but then you've got to change your entire hitting almost when you go back down to sea level and play against the Giants, or the Padres or whatever. And the breaking balls are breaking much more than they do at altitude. And, it's amazing that guys can actually still continue to hit and be effective players when you're making those sorts of changes, on a regular basis every week of the season. So that's something that I kind of, it's a non-measurable thing, but I give Helton and Larry Walker before him, I give those guys credit for being able to continually make those adjustments.
You said it's getting tighter and tighter, tougher and tougher. And I hate to put you on the spot with this. And again, it's nothing personal with the player, but Harold Baines doesn't reek of Hall of Fame to me. I think it was longevity. No. I think it was compiler, and by all counts, good guy, team player, solid, consistent. Okay, fine. In his era per se, played very well when it came to the postseason. I think 354 and 31 career postseason games. But again, that's today's game committee, right? That's the election method. So
that was not the BBWAA.
Yeah. Can you explain to people that are what, like, I think they get confused when they see a player like this. They don't understand.
Right.
You're a voter in the BWA as opposed to today's game committee.
Yeah. And Harold Baines was a classic case of, that 16-member committee or however many were on that committee at the time. Tony La Russa was one of the people on that committee. And, Tony La Russa managed Harold Baines, loved Harold Baines as a player. Harold Baines did wonderful things for Tony La Russa's team. I mean, here's the thing, you expect managers to go to the mat for their players. You expect them to be loyal, to be supporters. I mean, that's what managers and coaches do, is they want to make sure that you are, your self-confidence is high and you believe that you're a great player.
Yep.
And when you're getting, people in, making calls on the Hall of Fame, and you've got a guy's manager, he's going to have a whole lot of sway,
Right.
because
Yeah.
obviously the other people in the room are going to say, well, what was he like as a player?
Yeah.
And you don't know all the stuff that I know in the locker room, in the clubhouse, that, he was great and this and that. And yes, while Harold Baines was a fantastic player, a fantastic person, you can say that him being in the Hall of Fame does kind of water down the electorate, because he's not as great as some of the others that are in.
It's a good point with the manager, right? It's like a buddy, you walking in somebody's resume for a job interview. This is my buddy, right? Take the resume. And correct me if I'm wrong. Didn't he managed some 2 stints, right? Because he started with the White Sox, right? Wasn't Baines with the White Sox in the 80s? Didn't Lou Russo, didn't he manage the White Sox early 80s? Then he went to the A's later on, I believe. So yeah, and again, it's nothing personal with these players, right? But there are some players that I've watched, or I've gone back and I've watched and I've studied and I looked at their careers and I looked at the numbers, and I always like to compare them. And I'm like, man, what are we missing here? Do you, and I always appreciate the extra time before I let you get out of here. Where are we going when it comes to the Clemens, the Bonds, the Rodriguez? I know you still believe, hey, if you're going to put them in, asterisk it, right? Where are we at with those said players, right? That steroid era, those guys, Rodriguez, the ones that we know are Hall of Famers.
I think there's enough of a voting block that are never steroid, none of those cheating steroid guys are ever getting in on my watch. We're kind of past that though now, as once we get to A-Rod and Manny Ramirez, we get past those guys, then you're going to have every player that's going to be on the ballot down the road will have played during the testing era. And so then we've got, a second subset of guys. I think the ones, the Bonds and the Clemenses and all those guys, they're going to be forever on the outside looking in, barring some huge sea change of, difference of opinion, the way that fans look at baseball down the road. So I think the boat is sailed for those guys, and A-Rod and Manny too.
What about the guys in the 70s with the greenies and the uppers, right? There was always, the Nickers with the spitballs. There's always an edge, right? I mean, there was always I know it's kind of apples and oranges a little bit, but, and look, my stance. To me, those players were Hall of Famers even before stuck a needle in them or a cream or whatever, right? They were Hall of Famers. They just put up ridiculous numbers. It's hard to tell.
The numbers were too good. Well, I think that's really the problem. The numbers were too good. Yeah. And if Barry Bonds had only hit 50 home runs instead of 73, maybe we're not having this conversation, and he's already in.
Well, you look at when he was a skinny kid with Pittsburgh, and then, like I said, he looked like a walking candy apple when he was with the Giants. I mean, you just can't. It's just crazy. You can't dismiss that, but you also can't. Like I said, you walk through and you're looking, especially for the younger generation, right? The younger guys. That's why I made the joke that no one under 30 knows who the hell Scott Rolen is. They don't, and certainly they don't know who Greg Nettles is. But hey, it always makes for a good topic. Listen, I appreciate the transparency. You know how I get when we have these conversations and these debates. I love to learn. I like you walk me through the process.
It's fun. It's fun to see you get fired up too. That's the other thing. So I know your viewers and listeners enjoy that.
Well, it doesn't take much to poke the bear a little bit. But I just, like I said, and it's not even being a New York guy or, Yankees. And it's just, I brought up the same guys to you, I think, for how many years now? I mean, McGriff, I push. You look at the numbers and finally it happens. But that's fascinating stuff. I appreciate you giving a little insight and a little transparency. And like you said, right, some of these guys probably don't want to know. People don't want them to know where they live. Hey, real quick, 30 seconds. NFC, AFC championship. What are your official predictions?
I'm leaning the home teams. I think Philly wins it, and I think Kansas City, even though the Bengals are favored, and we don't know what's happening with Patrick Mahomes and how close to 100% he's going to be. I think he finds a way, and so we'll look at Chiefs Eagles.
That means I got 2 weeks of dealing with the Eagles fans. All right, that doesn't
Oh
sit
dear.
well with me. I got to get rid of my little blue helmet back there. All right, my friend. I always appreciate you making a couple moments. Give Steve a follow on Twitter at Steve A. Gardner. Does a great job covering baseball, fantasy sports, reporter, voter. Fantastic job. Always kind enough to join me on a Wednesday edition of Back Your Play. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks so much, Rich. Always a pleasure.
Be well.